Helmet's Meantime. What an absolute timeless classic, right? One of the greats. This amp belongs to Pete, who, along with Paige, was a founding member of Helmet and played on Strap It On and the Meantime album. Pete now lives in Australia. He's an Australian, actually. This is his mid-80s 2204, which he bought in New York City and took home with him back to Brisbane, Australia. And he sent it to me because, well, frankly, he told me he's never really liked the sound of it. Right? We do know, we've focused on this on the channel before, these horizontal input JCM 800s, 2204s and the 2203s, they're a bit brittle sounding compared to the earlier JCM 800s and the JMPs that preceded that, right? Both of which had 2203 and 2204 circuits, and they can be made to sound exactly the same and fantastic, right? So we're going to pull this one apart, see what I can do with it, and Pete's pretty interested in some kind of hot rodding as well. No extra gain stages or anything like that, but let's see what we can do with this in terms of extracting a bit more juice out of it. Just flipped it around, as you can see, and this thing has had, like all 80s Marshalls and many of the 70s Marshalls, it's been modded. It's had something done to it, right? So this is an effects loop. Well, holes for an effects loop. There's a send and return and a loop level. So pretty keen to see what sits inside this. Maybe it's been returned back to mid-80s stock, or there could be something left over from this mod that could be impacting the tone here, right? Let's pull it apart, see what we can find. All right, let's have a look at this 2204. First thing we're going to point out is this, right? So that handwriting is the same as the markings on the back for the send, return, and send level. So obviously, this is the tech that did that work. Love, peace, and happiness. Mr. Science, Seattle, Washington, USA. Not sure about that, but anyway, good to see that he left a calling card. And you can see there's been a hole punched out here, which would presumably have been for this loop. It's all been ripped out, which is good to see. But I'm assuming that was perhaps a tube buffered loop there. Not really sure, but that's all I can make of that. If we look at the circuit, I've had a couple of minutes to look at this board, and I think it's pretty original. Now, I can see quite a lot of evidence that the board's been worked on and soldered from the top. That's kind of the telltale signs, right? Bit of solder, bit of flux. See here particularly, right? But it has been restored. Presumably there were some mods here that have been reversed out. You can see, kind of the signs here. Hopefully that's coming through on the camera, but you can kind of see where these resistors have been soldered back in from the top, which is a technique that you can apply. And however, it's been kind of pushed back, as I said, to pretty original stock. So you just come kind of through here, right? 2K7 cathode with the 0.68 bypass. Is our 68K and 1 meg to ground. just on the first grid. Standard 100k plate resistor, 0.022 first coupler. Here's in a 2204 or a 2203, right? The 470k and 470 picofarad straight off out of the first coupler into the gain pot. Right, this guy here, big disc ceramic, is a 1 nanofarad bright cap, which is really great to see in place. Often I've opened up these amps and that bright cap's been clipped out, so that's cool. 10k cathode, right? So it is still a traditional 2204 with the 10k cold clipper, and you can see this one's kind of had a bit of work done on it. I wonder whether there was a bypass cap in here or maybe a different resistor at some point as part of a earlier mod. Another 0.022 coupler out of that second stage, 100k cathode, 100k plate, I should say, resistor for V1B. There's our 10k dropper for the B plus line, 820R resistor, right? 470k voltage divider with the 470 picofarad. This is all standard, totally standard 2204. Right, 100k plates, and then we kind of get into, you know, the cathode follower and the tone stack arrangement. So here's our 100k cathode resistor on the cathode follower stage. So moving along, we've got, this is actually the input into the phase inverter. You can check the old schematics of the 2204. Then we're the tone stack here. 33k slope resistor, treble, middle, bass, phase inverter setup. This all looks pretty good, right? I don't think any of this has been changed. It all looks completely original. Completely original. Well, these pots looking pretty good nick, actually. Overall, this is pretty good condition, considering the holes that were drilled into the back. Kind of worried that this thing would be a bit of a mess inside, and I have been surprised and disappointed before. This all looks really nice and original. I'm going to check some voltages, take some voltage readings. We'll do that now. Right, the amp's up, running, out of standby. I'm at standard 240 mains here, and let's just have a look straight on this first mains filter cap. 453, so that's pretty healthy, to be expected. And how's that translating onto the plates? 450. Okay, the difference between that voltage there and what's on your actual pin 3 of your power tubes is the slight voltage drop that you get through the primary wind of the output transformer. Right, let's move to the screen supply node, which is this guy. All right, so that's supplying, that's the yellow wire, and it goes off to the screen pins, right, through the 1k screen resistor. So that's always pin 4, and will always be just a few voltage. You'd expect it to be a volt or two down from, that's the plate, and that's the screen grid. Okay, pin 5 are the actual grid, the input, right? And if you measure a DC voltage on here, this is your bias DC voltage. Always should be negative, and hovering close to minus 40 is kind of what you'd, you know, just rule of thumb stuff, right? So minus 37 suggests that this is biased probably, you know, correctly, or maybe slightly on the warm side. It's all good. This side of the 10k dropper, that's our phase inverter supply. Now this is where we get into with the 2204, this generation of 2204 with the horizontal inputs. The voltages from the phase inverter through the rest of the preamp are quite a lot higher than they were in the vertical input 2204s. Right? And this is what drives a lot of that brittleness. The really high plate voltage is not always a good thing. Right? It can lead to the amp sounding a bit, you know, strident, in your face, brittle, just not that pleasant. So in that previous video where I actually worked on one of these and brought it back to vertical input spec, that was where I added additional dropping resistors in there to bring this voltage out. In this kind of amp, this circuit, I'm looking for about 330, between 320 and 330 at that phase inverter node. That is the sweet spot. And if we go down, just move this over this side, then we've only got one other 10k dropper here, right? Which is, so there's our 370, and then 360, which feeds the whole rest of the preamp. So on these, this is the plate resistor for V1A. Its supply voltage is 360, and the plate voltage for the first gain stage is 270, right? So this would be 270 right here. That's high, right? And this is what these circuits are. But to sweeten this amp up, I will be dropping those voltages. Let's have a listen to how this thing sounds. Okay, one thing about working on these mid-80s 2203, 2204s, right? It's kind of, let's call it second generation 800s. The good old horizontal inputs is that because everything's on the PCB like this, right? In the first generation ones, right, and the latter JMPs, of course, you had a printed circuit board mounted on the chassis, wired to chassis mounted pots. Now we've got Marshall moved to PCB mounted pots. Now it makes the amp kind of much more difficult to modify if you were so inclined, because the pots are hardwired to the printed circuit board, right? You can't, very difficult to kind of change the the wiring layout. However, it does actually make working on the board really easy, because all you need to do is unscrew, take off the knobs, unscrew the pots and the jacks, and you can just lift the board up. So it's really easy. Kind of get a soldering iron in under here for any components that you need to replace and or modify to work on one of these things. So, some disadvantages and some advantages. Just one other thing I've noticed, I've started to kind of work on this, right? So the first thing we're going to do here is just get the voltages and the B plus line back to the early 80s spec, and I've kind of started that by pulling some of these dropping resistors out. I've got an earlier video that shows and talks about exactly this kind of voltage mod. I spoke to Peter, and he told me that, he confirmed that the effects loop mod was done in Seattle, subsequently was reversed out by a tech in Brisbane, Australia, who has returned this amp, to pretty much bone stock. I can see right now that I've moved this around, there's, I don't know if you can see that on the video, right, but these pots have been greased up, pretty oily. I'm not too sure what that is. It doesn't smell like WD-40, thankfully, but it is pretty, I wouldn't use oil like that. I would use contact cleaner, deox, that kind of stuff. It does feel a bit oily. Anyway, that's not what I really want to talk about. What I want to show you is the grounding. This is really interesting. I'm going to take this out. So in our standard Marshall grounding, this can cap here is actually grounded to the chassis, right? This is the ground for the preamp, and correspondingly the screen filter cap has its own ground, as does the mains, right? You can see it here, right? Hope you can see that. Here's the ground lug and our can cap, and it's wired to a ground lug to the chassis. It's got its own ground, and that's separated from that, and that's separated from there. Now, the tech that worked on this decided to link all of these, including the separate earth for the power, which should always be on its own standalone one, shouldn't be shared. So that bridge to there, that's bridge to there, that's bridge to there, that is bridge to there. No idea why, but I'm going to take all that out, put that back to how Marshall originally intended it. All right, so I have now rewired the B plus line on this thing to be true to the original. There were a bunch of questions I recall from the last time I did this, so I will just take a moment to trace it through, right? The important thing to kind of remember, I guess, or maybe a helpful tip, is that the supply line for your tube amp kind of follows a pattern, right? Which is filter cap, drop-in resistor, filter cap, drop-in resistor, filter cap, drop-in resistor, filter cap, and so on and so on. So the kind of the way that this is configured is to stay true to that and have it cascade all the way so that V1 still gets its own supply, because the way that these are wired up from the factory from Marshall is, you know, one of the gain stages in here is kind of missing its own supply line, right? So V2 is basically bypassed completely. So you go from kind of phase inverter through to preamp, and that's it. It's missing one of the dropping nodes. So the way we fix it is this can cap here, which is normally bridged together for the screens, you break that, right? So what it means is in these configured as stock, it's 100 microfarad screen filtering, which is really stiff. It's one of the reasons why these amps, these vertical input amps, horizontal input amps are really kind of brittle and stiff, right? 100 microfarad screen filtering is super, super stiff. So we break that and we give 50, these are 2x50s, right? So we give 50 to the screen and then 50 for the phase inverter. All right, so I basically chop that. The blue wire here is connected here to this node, this side of this 10K dropper. That's screen supply node. So now that's at 50 microfarad. I lift one leg of this 10K drop-in resistor and I've inserted another 10K. So there's a 20K dropping between the screen supply node and this on this side is the phase inverter node. And the phase inverter supply goes all the way down this track here on this PCB. All right. Here I've removed this 100K resistor and it's gone onto the tube as they were in the previous generation amps. And because there's some spare holes here now, right, I have wired this red wire here, comes in to the board at this point right here, and the red wire runs in under and connects to this side. This is 50 microfarad. So now we've got 100 microfarad mains, right, that's left untouched, 50 microfarad screen node supply filter, 20K dropper, then 50 microfarad phase inverter filter at this point. Okay, from here, right, this continues to run along and this red wire here comes off and that's this one here, right? So now I've got a 10K dropper. This is heat shrink, but it's a 10K, right? 10K 3 watt resistor there. A 2 watt resistor is fine. You don't want 1 watt, too small. 2 to 3 watt. So 10K here. So phase inverter filter, 50 microfarad, red wire, 10k dropper. Now, onto here. This is now another 50 microfarad filter. And it is supplying, you see how I've run this red wire here? Directly onto the can cap. That used to be on the board. And that is to one side. That's to the cathode follower. Okay? And then there's our 100k resistor. This wiring here is as it was in all of the vintage Marshalls. Okay, but I'm running the supply for the plate of the cathode follower directly to this can cap. All right, so 10k, 50 microfarad. This 10k dropper here used to be on the board. Here, I think it was here, yeah. 10k dropper to the last 50 microfarad, and that red wire there returns to the board and is the supply node for V1. This is now configured exactly as the 2204 JMPs and the early 80s JCM 800s. I'm going to power this up and we'll check some voltages and make sure it's all in spec. All right, we've got it powered up. It's running at 240 on the mains, so we're at standard wall voltage here. And I just want to run through and measure the voltages for you, and we will compare them to the old Marshall schematic from 1981, right, which is the era that we're trying to replicate here. And it's the voltages against the 2203, because in that era of Marshalls, the 2203 had the plate voltage, or the B plus voltage, of around kind of this level, right? It's about 460. The 50 watters in the early 80s, late 70s, had that kind of lower B plus, right, 370. So, you know, this is kind of cranking up at 450. So the closest thing that we can match it to from this vintage era is the 2203 to 100 watt, right? So that's what we're going to do. This is the mains voltage, the B plus mains. This is the plate voltage on pin 3, 447. Okay, this is the screen pin, and here's our screen supply node. All right, so we'll map these against the voltage chart in the Marshall schematic. Here's our phase inverter node over here now, 331, right? So if you watch the channel, you'll know I talk about this, 320 to 330 in a Plexi or a 2203, 2204 is the sweet spot for the phase inverter supply node. And if you get that dialed in at that level, you kind of know that you're in the ballpark here, right? This is the supply node now for V2, the cathode follower. Let me get a reading on this, 297. And this is the supply node for V1, 287. Right, let's compare them. So to check the voltages post the changes that I've made to the B plus line, I'm going to reference these beautiful old schematics for the JCM 800 lead series, right, 1981. So these little pieces of gold here, and when I say these is because there's actually two of them, right? There's the preamp and there's the power amp. And remember, right, the 800 is a series of amps, right? Everyone talks about 800s like they're a particular model. They're not, right? It's a series. And you can see here, right, as used on, blah, 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 right? 50 watt, 100 watt, standard, and master volume, right? So standard means non-master volume. So in 1981, a standard amp meant no master volume. You gotta love that, right? So as you can see here, right, these are the models. 1987, 1959, this is the preamp. And then for the master volumes, 2103, 2203, 2104, 2204. These are all JCM 800s. All right, so at least 6 different models within the same series. So So I kind of try to always use the term on the channel here. I try to use the actual model designation rather than just 800, because 800 is a very broad term. This doesn't even include the 2205, right, which is a completely different circuit, still called a JCM 800. However, what I wanted to talk about, getting back on topic here, the voltages. Now, you can see in the 50 watt power section here that here is our voltage here at the screen supply, 365, right? So a couple of volts on this side will be the plates, 367. This is the, you've probably heard about this era of 50 watt Marshalls having low plate voltages. Well, here they are, right? 367, 370, around that kind of thing. However, the 100 watts still had, here you go, 470 volts here, 468 on this side of the choke, and this is a screen supply. Okay, and then as we go into the preamps, you can see these are a little bit blurry, right? But you can kind of make them out. The 100 watt is the voltages that we're going to reference here in the preamp, because this mid-80s 2204 is back up at 460 odd volts on the plates. So the closest thing to it is what's going on here with the 100, right? I'm not going to try to compare it to the 50 because the plate voltages are way too low. On the 100, see these guys here, all right? This is our plate voltage, screen node voltage, two 10k droppers, and then that says point A. All right, if we go across here, here's point A. All right, this is our phase inverter. So this is A is the phase inverter supply. All right, so importantly, two 10k droppers. Now, you would have seen in the stock amp, right? These horizontal input 2204s have only got one 10k dropper, but they've got a plate voltage that is pretty close to this. So the voltage at the phase inverter with the stock amp, it's just too high. Right? I've already talked about that a lot. So let's compare. I'll put it up on the screen here, right? I'll just grab a few voltages from this table and the voltages that I just measured with the voltmeter with this 2204 after I've made these changes to the B+. So here is the finished amp, right, with the mods and the additions that I made to it. I just thought I'd do a quick overview. If you were interested and you've made it this far into the video, you would have seen me do this kind of thing on the channel many times, right? Inspired by, definitely, the J.K. Lee style 2204, 2203 circuit that Dave does. Okay, so let's have a look here. First coupling cap is changed to a 0.0022. Lean out the bass, right? I've covered this many times on the channel, right? So maybe this picture here just gives you an idea of kind of how to approach implementing those mods, which I have documented many times, into this style of the 2204 or the 2203 for that matter. It's limited to what you can do with one of these amps, right? But with the traditional master volume placement here, without going to kind of pre-tone stack Jose Master pathway, this is a killer, I think, a killer set of mods that you can make to an amp like this. So we've got that there. Underneath this is a 0.68 microfarad bypass cap. Underneath that is a 3K3 resistor. And on these boards, right, I think that's C6. It's empty, right? So that it's pre-drilled and ready to go. You just drop that in there, and that parallels in with the 10K. This is our 10K cold clipper cathode resistor, second gain stage, right? Standard 2203, 2204. We've covered this so many times. All right, throw that in parallel, put the 0.68 over the top. Now you'll see I've also shielded coax to the first grid. If you keep that as an unshielded cable, you'll find that as soon as you've kind of, this introduces quite a lot more gain into the amp, right? That'll get very noisy. So that's just kind of good practice to do that. Here I've got a electrolytic bypass cap over the 820 ohm cathode, which is the cathode for V2A, this guy here. Right, that's you can go anywhere from 0.68 to 20 or 22 microfarad, right? The lower the value, you'll get more kind of top end bite. The higher the value, the more kind of fat there will be. This is where the location of where Eddie had his infamous fat cap. So you can kind of play with that value. I'm in the middle here. This is a 10 microfarad electrolytic cap I'm using here. All right, this is a 470 picofarad across the cathode resistor to ground for the cathode follower. This is this side of V2B. This is kind of sometimes known as the dark mod. All right, this bleeds off some top end to ground, takes it out of your signal before it hits the tone stack. So that's a kind of nice way to keep the high end under control. That's optional, right? If you want something that's got more zing, more bite, you can leave that out. Now, you can see I've dropped in one of my headfirst effects loops here, and because of the way that this thing was drilled, I didn't want to drill any more holes in this chassis, right? So I kind of reused what was there. This thing is mounted in securely. I ended up making sure that this was absolutely dead, solid in here. And you can see I've had to kind of lift that. Well, I didn't even solder it in, right? The Sen jack is off the board and running a couple of very, very short fly leads there so that I could reuse those holes. And over here, what I've implemented is a post loop volume, right? So one of the tricks with this was to put an effects loop into one of these boards. You want to sit it in between the way I did it anyway, the volume, right? So here's the treble pot. The treble wiper goes across straight to the master volume, and then from the master volume output, we normally go straight into the phase inverter, which is C9. You can kind of follow this track, right? You see it here, and it goes up there and across. That's the volume, right? It's the output. It's the wiper of the volume pot. Comes out. Oh, this one, sorry. Comes out. C9, and then through C9, your AC audio signal, right? Off it goes, and it hits into the phase inverter here. So pulling C9 out, what I've been able to do is kind of interrupt the signal in the amp to insert my effects loop, and here's the in and the out. And the in is coming from this side of C9. So the volume on the front of the amp is like a send level now to the effects loop, and it goes into the effects loop, all right, out, and I'll over to this pot here, which I'll show you in a second, right, which is the post loop master volume, and then out of that pot it comes back in, hits this other side of C9, and then back into the phase inverter, which is how you would wire that effects loop, right? Normally between after the tone stack and before the phase inverter. And here's a picture here, which kind of shows my post loop master here. This cap here, this was C9, right? So I'm reusing the amp parts to the extent that's possible. So I pulled that out, and you've still got to have that cap there, right? You can't come off this board and then hit it straight into the phase inverter. You need that cap, and that cap is actually to block DC from the phase inverter. If you don't have that there, then the DC grid voltage to your input to your phase inverter will make its way back onto your earlier stages of the amp and screw things up badly. So that is still there. What I've done is I've actually nestled that in there nice and tight. It's soldered in to the wiper of this. This is the 250K audio pot. So we come out of the loop. Actually, let's go back a step. We come out of the volume, right? Out of the volume wiper to this side of C9, top of C9. We come into the loop. All right, and that goes send and return, and then out of the loop, here's our post loop master. Here's the input to the pot, all right, and the wiper, which gives our volume adjustment, into the cap, out of the cap, back into the shielded coax, and into this side of C9. Dead quiet, completely transparent, works fantastically.